Please unmute. I have a fantastic guest today. My guest today is Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman at Ogilvy, the author of the book Alchemy, Ideas That Don't Make Sense, and a world-known behavioral marketing expert. Rory, I was always enthusiastic about marketing and behavioral psychology. And I read your book, Alchemy. I watched your TED Talks and much more. And that is why I was and I am so excited about our chat today. And that is why this is the first time I put on a jacket for a video interview. I hope you can live up to those high expectations.
I'm very flattered. I feel I've let you down by only wearing a t-shirt. But you can take some comfort from the fact that for this interview, I got my hair cut on Saturday, which was the first time since March. So that's my own particular effort for the
That's
talk.
Amazing.
My first ever haircut in about 6 months.
Wow, thank you. I feel honored.
It's very interesting. You talk about marketing and innovation, and I've always seen marketing and innovation as being two sides of the same coin. Now, if that sounds a bit of an eccentric view, it's worth remembering that some schools of economics, in particular the Austrian school, that's Hayek, von Mises, Schumpeter, people like that, they accepted the fact that value was subjective and that you could create it in the mind just as much as you could create it in the factory. And so to an Austrian viewpoint, someone who finds a particularly new way of selling something or presenting something, or by placing something in a different context, makes its value more apparent, is just as much in the business of value creation as someone manufacturing or designing something new in a factory. In other words, marketing is an essential and inescapable part of the process of value creation to the Austrians. To mainstream economists, they tend to believe that value is resident in the good or the service, and that all marketing does is interfere with people's perceptions, and therefore it's kind of cheating. Now, what I think is important to remember is there are two ways of innovating, and we occasionally use the phrase in my own behavioral science practice, innovation, which is spelled I-N-N-E-R, which is innovation in the head rather than innovation in the world of physics. And what I mean by that is that, in a sense, there are two ways you can actually innovate. You can either find out what people want and work out an ingenious way to make it, or you can work out what you can make and find an ingenious way to make people want it. And the net economic effects of both of these is exactly the same. You've created an innovation. And so you can create innovation in behavior just as much as you can create innovation in the physical space. And I think Peter Thiel's quite interesting on this. He always says that, look, if you've got a brilliant invention and it's a fantastic product and on its objective characteristics are magnificent, but you haven't worked out a way to sell it to someone, what you in fact have is a lousy business. Bill Gates said something similar when he said, the problem I face now is that people don't know how to want the things we can offer them. And I think I take the quite extreme view that one of the principal obstacles and constraints to economic growth, economic progress, technological progress, environmental progress even, the principal constraints are often psychological, not mechanical. In other words, it isn't a supply problem anymore, it's a demand problem. We already have the solar panels, we already have the electric cars, we already had video conferencing 2.5 years ago, which could have reduced carbon emissions massively and saved companies a fortune. But for whatever reason, it's not as if anything changed about Zoom. The pricing has remained the same, the technology has remained the same since March. And yet it took a pandemic to get people to adopt it to anything like its sensible extent. And so I think that we're probably looking too frequently to try and innovate the world of things. What we really need now is not, even more efficient solar panels. They've reached a fairly, the great thing with the laws of physics is you do tend to reach, at some point, practical limitations. The laws of psychology are much more fluid, however. You can just change the way you present a price and you can make something that did seem expensive suddenly seem cheap. And so it's worth remembering that, you know, you can't cheat the laws of physics, but to some extent there is a form of alchemy or magic that's possible if you exploit the laws of psychology and perception. And, you know, I mean, I would argue that, you know, the great problem with solar panels, yes, it would be great if we could make them 5% more efficient or 10% more efficient. But the real outstanding problem now is that people are unwilling to install them on their homes. And, you know, apart from anything else, I mean, human behavior is very, very heavily driven by two invisible forces, which are every bit as powerful as gravity, and they are habit and social copying. That, you know, we tend to like doing things that we've done before, and we tend to like doing things that we see lots of other people doing. And so the very process of innovation is, of course, running counter to those two forces. And I'm always intrigued when I see billion-dollar companies, which I think in a way are in as much a product of having stumbled on a psychological breakthrough as a technological one. And the example I often give of this, by the way, is Zoom. Sorry, I often give Zoom as an example, but in this case, Uber. I think Uber, about 50% of the magic of Uber resides in the map. And the Uber map, which shows your car approaching, exploits a very interesting but not often remarked upon psychological bias, which is it's not the duration of the wait that bothers us, it's the degree of uncertainty. Train companies eventually discovered this, that people would rather wait 9 minutes for a train with a sign saying Charing Cross 9 minutes than wait 5 minutes for a train in a state of not knowing when the train's going to come. And so Uber is an example I would give of Apple would be another one, Dyson would be another one, Starbucks, actually, definitely Nespresso. All of them are massively successful, in part because of the technology they bring to bear, but in particular because they happen to stumble on a deep-set human need, which was deeply felt but largely unvoiced. It was something that market research wouldn't really tell you. Because everybody would say, I want my cab to arrive as quickly as possible. If you ask people, they'd say, I want my cab to arrive as quickly as possible. And of course, there's an SI unit for duration. So it's something you can measure and you can put into data models. But in fact, interestingly, what people really care about is knowing where their cab is. And if they can see the cab's detained at a set of traffic lights, they'll go, oh, well, I'll make myself a cup of tea, or I'll do a few emails while I'm waiting. They're not that bothered by that. What they can't stand is the uncertainty, that period of, is that my car outside now or isn't it? And so I find those things deeply interesting. And I always think that, in fact, marketing and innovation probably, there are two parts of the business which don't get on particularly well, but in a more sensible world, they'd be bedfellows.
Roy, that's an amazing introduction to our topic and very intriguing perspective indeed. So I would love to come back to that in a couple of minutes, but first take a step back and start with. So you describe yourself as the vice chairman of Ogilvy, an attractively vague job title, which has allowed him to co-found a behavioral science practice within the agency. So 2 questions for you. First of all, what is Ogilvy? And second, what's your mission at Ogilvy? And how did you manage to co-found a behavioral science practice within one of the most well-known advertising agencies in the world?
Well, it all dates back. Ogilvy, which works extensively with Samsung, particularly on the Galaxy range of phones, is one of the world's largest advertising networks and is part of WPP. It's a creative agency network. And I felt, I suppose strongly, that when media agencies and creative agencies were separated, for reasons I still don't fully understand, to be absolutely honest. But when the media discipline and the media planning discipline was separated from the creative discipline, I always felt that the creative agencies had lost something and they needed something else to replace it. And so the behavioral science practice sits as part of Ogilvy's consulting arm. And what we do is we go to clients and we look for precisely those things which we occasionally call unspotted opportunities. that most businesses like to proceed through very rational, deterministic lines. In other words, we are improving this device through increasing the clock speed or the memory capacity or the processor power. And it's vitally important that you understand how that translates to real human perception. And I ended up finding the behavioral science practice. By background, I'm not a psychologist. The behavioral science practice consists of about 15 people, all of whom, except me, have a psychology background of some kind. I was a classicist, would you believe it? But about, I suppose in about 2007, I was ill with flu for a week and off work. And I started reading books about economics. Don't know why. It's just when you're ill, you do that kind of thing. And it's not just you have to be sick to study economics. And the advertising man in me was fascinated by this because it was a very, very elegant theory, but it didn't really describe real world human behavior remotely accurately. It was an elegant post-rationalization of how humans perhaps should behave. But it seemed to me that the predictive power was hopeless, that all around me in the world of consumer capitalism, I could see cases where, for example, the standard rules of economics don't apply. I'll give you an example of that actually in flagship phones. If you produce your top of the range Galaxy phone, you almost have to make it as expensive as an iPhone. Even if economically you could undercut Apple, you have to match Apple's price, because if you don't, there's an implicit admission of failure in the pricing. That would be an example where the pricing of something does not follow the normal laws of economics, where if you make something cheaper, more people will buy it. There are many, flagship phones would be an interesting category, but there are many, many categories, in fact, where you can put the price up and demand, in fact, goes up rather than down. And it's vital that people who buy a flagship non-Apple phone are seen to be making a choice, not a compromise. And so, undercutting Apple to too great an extent would actually be a dangerous approach. And there's probably actually in flagship phones, there's an element of luxury good or Veblen good as well, which is it's a visible display of prosperity rather as luxury fashion is or the watch trade is. But so I was fascinated by essentially what economics was wrong about. And I discovered there was this science, again, by reading widely on economics online, that there was this science called behavioral economics, and that Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein were shortly to publish a book called Nudge on how you could use persuasive techniques and framing techniques to change behavior. Economics is incredibly creatively limiting, because it essentially says there are only two ways you can basically improve things. You can reduce the price, or you can actually add to the physical objective attributes of the product. There's no room for sort of creative presentation, marketing, or any other kind of ingenuity in an economic model. And so it's incredibly limiting creatively. And I realized that the great thing about behavioral science was that once you admitted psychology into the equation, the possible solution space became much bigger. Now, I spent my time as president of the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, which is, to Americans, it's like the 4 A's. And I was president for the standard term of 2 years. And I made behavioral economics my kind of watchword and my central plank of that presidency, which was getting advertising people to understand psychology and behavioral science better. Because in many cases, it would not only inform what they do, but it also explained sometimes why their instincts were right and why the client's reasoning, however logical, might be wrong. And then when I left that presidency period in 2011, I founded a practice at Ogilvy. It is quite good, by the way. I'm being vice chairman. Having a few people in the payroll whose job isn't entirely defined in advance isn't a bad approach. Because allowing a certain degree of autonomy, Google used to do that 20% free time principle. Giving people a certain degree of autonomy to pursue their interests is a very good way of innovating. In fact, many, many innovation labs have actually produced almost as much through their employees' hobbies as through their kind of preordained areas of research. Quite a lot of discovery is, by the way, accidental. Let's be honest about that. Yeah. It's not all, scientific discovery is by no means always planned in advance. And so actually having a degree of variety just increases your upside exposure to luck. And so we created this behavioral science practice. We've grown as much as you can within a large organization. This is why I think it's sensible not basing you near headquarters. You need a certain degree of autonomy in order to grow innovatively within a large organization. But what we've done is we've spent the time looking at, I suppose it's largely looking at those things which in other words, looking at those solutions that you'll never find if you strictly adhere to the standard twin lenses of market research and economic logic. Because there are things that consumers will never tell you because they're felt, not said. And there are things that economics is fundamentally wrong about. And it's only by understanding those things that you have the chance of coming up with a solution that's truly distinctive. Because being honest, if you defy conventional logic and you ignore market research, it's probably fair to say that your chance of success goes down a little. Your chance of moderate success, but your chance of disproportionate success goes up massively.
Right.
Because when you do make an innovation that defies a little bit of conventional logic, Red Bull is a classic example I always give, okay?
Sure.
The Coca-Cola company, imagine trying to get the idea of Red Bull through Coke, okay? So first of all, you'd assume that to compete with Coke, you needed a drink that tasted as nice as Coke, cost the same or less than Coke, and came in a really big bottle. Red Bull comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, it tastes disgusting. And that's not a subjective opinion. When they researched it, the company that researched Red Bull said this is the worst carbonated drink we've ever researched in the history of the company. People were saying things like, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. And I think what Red Bull accidentally discovered is that, of course, if you're a drink like Fanta, okay, all the things that make you a good drink, relatively low price, high volume, delicious taste, are the opposite of what you want if people think you're a drug. Because drugs have to taste weird, come in a kind of limited container to suggest they're really potent. You should only take one of these. The placebo effect is always rendered much more powerful if you tell people the drugs are expensive. And even better, of course, Red Bull now, you can't sell it to under 16s, which is a gift in a sense to Red Bull marketers. Because if you want to make something feel like a powerful, and it's essentially a kind of placebo in a can, it's a really, really potent, mood-enhancing substance rather than a drink. And so similarly, I look at, you must get bored. You must get sick of people quoting Apple because Samsung is a significantly more innovative company in aggregate than Apple is. So, let's be honest here, in terms of the amount of innovation you've performed. But there was that one Steve Jobs thing, which is everybody was asking, what can a phone do? And Steve Jobs, I am a Samsung user, I'm not an Apple user in any shape or form, just to be clear. But what Jobs did do, which was ingenious, is he asked the question nobody else was asking, which was, yes, I understand what a phone can do, but what does it feel like while you're doing it? And in a sense, Uber accidentally or on purpose asked, yes, he said, I understand the whole business about waiting for a car, but what does the wait feel like while you're waiting? And since humans are driven by feelings, and feelings don't connect very well to thoughts, to conscious thoughts, certainly feelings don't come with an explanatory component. We just feel them without really knowing why. And it's vitally true in things like customer service or retail. A brilliant service employee can just have an extraordinary effect on how you feel. Tiny little things. I remember going to a restaurant. If they asked you, would you like to sit by the window or would you prefer to sit over there? You'll be much, much happier with where you're sitting than if you're told where to sit. That's a little behavioral science finding. People on airplanes are much, much happier sitting in seat 17A if they chose it than if they were put there.
Right.
And so understanding those quirks of human perception. Now, by the way, a lot of people go, yeah, but that's cheating. No. People should perceive the world objectively, but you're just exploiting the fact that we don't see the world objectively. I say, what is a television? Okay, a television doesn't produce the whole spectrum of colors. It's optimized for higher primate vision, and humans, along with, I think, gorillas and a few other higher primates, only detect red, green, and blue. So your television doesn't bother to produce lilac. It doesn't bother to produce indigo, because since we can only sense our brain extrapolates the whole spectrum of color, plus magenta, which is a color that doesn't even exist in physics, by the way, our brain extrapolates all that color from the relative strength of the three colors that it can detect. So if you think the behavioral science is cheating, well, your television is an outrageous scam. You know, now interestingly, of course, it means TVs are species specific. So you could potentially produce a dog television, but I think it would need to have two colors, and they'd be different colors to the colors found in human televisions. But if you think about it, a television is not designed around reproducing reality. It's designed around hacking perception. And there's no point in producing colors that we can't see. And in the same way, there's no point in optimizing business metrics that deep down humans don't really care about.
Right. Rory, can we have you again on the other cam?
Mm.
Any chance? Yeah, so we can see.
Sorry, I got distracted by my monitor.
Beautiful, beautiful eyes. Awesome. That's fantastic. As I said in the beginning, you're the author of a fantastic book called Alchemy: The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Any Sense.
Yeah.
I guess you already touched some of your key takeaways from your book, but could you give us a short elevator pitch about your book?
Yes, so essentially it's about this business of creating psychological value, that the biggest, I think, waste that happens in capitalism is when a company's metrics are misaligned with what consumers really, really care about at an emotional level. I mean, not purely at a conscious, deliberative level. And there's a great phrase, I think it's Peter Drucker: the worst thing that a business can do is pursue with great efficiency an activity which shouldn't be performed at all. And quite often, I think, companies have these metrics which are proxies for what consumers care about. And it leads to a misalignment of value creation, where the entity is trying to pursue some measure, possibly, for example, possibly it was a measure that consumers cared about in the early days, but which has just become diminishingly important.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lovely example of that in the history of Spotify, by the way, which is obviously in the very early days of streamed and downloaded music, there was a big lag. You clicked on a track and, you basically watched your watch, and 10 seconds later, the music would start. And Spotify went to their tech team and said, we want to reduce the lag so that when you click on a track, it starts playing pretty much immediately. And they came back some period later, and they said, we've managed to get it down to something like 175 milliseconds. And the person who'd set the task said, can't you get any lower than that? And the brilliant answer was, yes, you can, but there's no point. What? Because to the human brain, 175 milliseconds is undiscernible, or indiscernible, God, that's an interesting one, is indiscernible from being instantaneous. In other words, a human can't tell the difference between a song that starts after 75 milliseconds and 175. So there's no point in kind of, let's say, imperiling the streaming quality to reduce that metric still further, because as with, say, the retina screen, we've reached a point where there's no point in going any further because the person doesn't care. And I partly became famous enough to write the book Alchemy because of a TED talk I gave back in, I suppose it must have been 2008, 2009. And I just told a joke, which was about High Speed 2, the High Speed 1, in fact, the railway line between Paris and London. And they spent 6 billion laying high-speed tracks between the Kent coast and London to reduce the journey time from 3 hours and 20, to something like 2 hours and 45. And I said, that's perfectly valid, but that is what an engineer will always do if you give them a budget of £6 billion. They'll always reduce the objective journey time. In other words, the measured journey time. Now, there are reasons for that. You can get more use out of your rolling stock if it's traveling faster, for example. I'm not suggesting it's wholly foolish. But, I said, there are other solutions you could look at. I said, first of all, bear in mind this is 2009. There was no Wi-Fi on planes in 2009. I said, why didn't you put really good Wi-Fi on the train? Because then people will leave the aircraft to go by train, even if it's a bit slower. Now, the cost of putting Wi-Fi on the train would have been 1% of the cost of building those new tracks, maybe 2%. but it would have run into, you know, double-digit millions or something like that. Okay. Now, that would have been a far bigger determinant of whether valuable business travelers or indeed leisure travelers went by train than went by plane, than knocking 30 minutes off the journey. Because evidence showed that people were abandoning planes to go by train anyway because they enjoyed the journey more and there was less hassle going through security, all that sort of stuff. And also the journey was more productive because you sat in one place for 3 hours instead of moving from security to lounge to gate to check in to seat, you know, and then reversing the whole process at the other end. And then I said, as a bit of a joke, I said, of course, if you wanted to spend £1 billion rather than just 60 or 70 million, you could employ all of the world's top male and female supermodels, get them to walk up and down the train, handing out glasses of free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You'd have saved yourself £5 billion versus the tracks, and people would ask for the trains to be slowed down. And the joke there was that the assumption was that making something faster had to be better. But if you look at it laterally, no cruise ship sells itself on the basis of the fact that it's faster than the plane. A cruise ship sells itself on the basis that the journey is much more enjoyable than the plane equivalent. And so my argument was that everybody was trapped in this world where we assumed that objective measures from the world of science mapped directly and linearly onto human feelings. And the simple fact is there's a massive black box in between the two. It's like an enigma machine in between the two, you know. And so, yes, don't get me wrong. If you can improve something by a factor of 10, you know, if you can make something truly amazing, 10 times cheaper, 10 times faster, okay, humans notice and they care. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that, you know, that doesn't mean, and you know, I'm very, very sympathetic to technological moonshots for that reason, you know, just that big high-risk venture. But it doesn't mean that by improving something by 5%, you will continue to enjoy gains in terms of consumer value. Because sometimes you just hit a wall. And of course, it becomes more and more difficult to improve things physically because you run up against the laws of physics, as I suppose is happening in the semiconductor industry or will do soon. Whereas the laws of psychology are much more mutable.
So Rory, I'm sure that what you just said is very thought-provoking for a lot of founders out there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of engineers in tech companies get very angry when I say this because they see marketing as cheating, that the only true measure of product superiority to an engineer is engineering superiority, which means objective SI unit superiority. But the only point you've got to realize is that if you're an engineer and you want to impress the engineers you know in other companies, you want to do something that's better than them in engineering terms. And therefore you will earn the respect of your engineering peer group. But don't assume that the respect of fellow engineers will always translate into the respect and affection of consumers, because consumers aren't engineers and don't have the same criteria when deciding on a purchase. So I'll give you an example of this. So I frequently have conversations with a wonderful AI group, Wolfram it's called, which is run by Stephen Wolfram and his brother Conrad. Mm-hmm. And they're a kind of AI consultancy, and they were talking to me about products they were working on. And they said, we managed to use AI to produce the quietest possible electric motor for an electric razor. And I said, oh dear. If you're an engineer, you want to produce a beautifully quiet electric razor. If you're not careful, the consumer will translate quietness into not very powerful and not very effective. So if your electric razor is too silent, it will weird people out because they'll think it's not really doing the job. Just in the same way that, you know, there's a limit to how silent you want an electric car to be. And I said, well, if you do produce a really quiet motor, you might end up having to put a loudspeaker inside the razor that makes a really cool noise, because we use the motor whine to determine how close to press the razor to our chin. So we're using that noise as a feedback mechanism. And so a razor that's too silent might be difficult to use in the same way that a totally silent electric car would be difficult to drive. Because to a large extent, we use engine noise unconsciously to moderate what we're doing. We certainly use it to moderate gear changes in manual cars, but we also essentially, in an automatic, we'll use the sound of the car changing gear to effectively moderate what we're doing with the accelerator pedal. And so something which seems beautifully elegant to an engineer could be a problem to an end user.
Right, right. And like I personally think and always say that most founders, especially in B2B and especially engineering heavy startups, completely under-index on and underestimate marketing. Many founders don't understand that what you basically already said, that you can increase the price someone is willing to pay for your product,
yes,
not only by adding one feature after the other to your product, but by increasing the perceived value of your product, right?
Two examples I always give that.
Yeah, please.
To economists, if economists have one kind of absolute axiom, it's that price is objective, that a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. And I can tell you absolutely confidently as a marketer that this isn't true. The same thing can seem cheap or expensive depending on what you compare it to. So I'll give you two stories. Nespresso is a really interesting case in point because you pay by the sleeve or by the pod. And I know that an espresso pod costs around 40 pence in the UK. Now, if I ever did the maths and worked out how much it cost compared to Nescafe, I'd probably be horrified. Because for an equivalent amount of caffeine, I would imagine that a jar of Nespresso coffee would cost about 20 or 30 pounds. And you'd look at that, it's insane, I can't pay that. If it, unless it's Jamaican Blue Mountain, that's completely mad, okay? But the interesting thing is, because you pay by the pod, not by the jar, your frame of reference is Starbucks, not Nescafe. And you think, well, it's 40 pence, but that would have cost me £2.40 in Starbucks. This is a perfectly reasonable price to pay. And my father, he's now 90, but when he was about 80, he refused to get multi-channel television because he didn't want to pay. And he said, no, I looked at it, it's £17 a month, it's too much. I said, well, I'll pay for you, I don't mind. And he said, no, I don't want you paying £17 a month. It's just, it's a waste of money, it's too expensive. And then I did that Don Draper kind of mind trick, which is I said, but it isn't £17 a month, it's 60 pence a day. And he said, well, what difference does that make? I said, you spend £2 a day on newspapers. If you spend £2 a day on newspapers, it's not that crazy spending 60 pence to have, he's not interested in sport or movies, but to have, 15 news channels and, 100 factual channels like the Smithsonian Channel and PBS and Discovery and History. He loves that kind of factual stuff. I think that tends to be true of older people, actually. They like more factual television. And he went, oh, I see what you mean. And he went out, got Sky with his own money, incidentally. I didn't even have to pay. And he's now a sort of leading advocate and evangelist, going around all his nonagenarian friends saying, I can't believe you haven't got Sky. And that's a case where the same thing, depending on where you sell it and what you sell it against and what you compare it to, the same thing at the same price can look like a bargain or look like an extravagance. And so it's not safe to look at price as though the human perception of price is objective. And the other thing, you're absolutely right about B2B, because people tend to look at B2B on the assumption that B2B decisions are somehow completely rational. That obviously, yes, consumers buy cars for all kinds of emotional reasons. But once I put on a suit and sit at a desk, I somehow become this kind of calculating machine. I become a walking spreadsheet. And that isn't true either. And there's a huge amount of emotion going on in B2B decisions, partly because, of course, the stakes are so much higher and you're so much more frightened of blame.
True.
So I've often said, that maybe one of the reasons why there are so few accounting firms is that if you think about blame, if you appoint Pricewaterhouse or you appoint Deloitte, okay, and they mess up your audit, everybody blames Deloitte, okay? But if you appointed a small boutique accounting firm, they'd now blame you because you didn't appoint Deloitte or Pricewaterhouse or whatever. And so, it's one of those things I always notice that whenever you booked a flight to New York with Ogilvy, the travel people and the PAs would always put you on a flight from Heathrow to JFK. I mean, Ogilvy's offices are much closer to Newark than they are to JFK. And I suddenly realized what it is. It's the no blame option. Because there's nothing eccentric about Heathrow. I live miles from Heathrow. JFK is a long way from our offices, but it's the kind of default option. So if anything went wrong with my flight, I'd blame British Airways. But
Sure.
if my PA put me on a flight from Newark, say, or put me on a flight from Gatwick, and something went wrong, I might blame her. Because I might go, well, if you hadn't booked me from this
Right.
Toy Town airport, I'd be in New York by now. You know, what were
Right.
you
Right.
thinking booking me from Gatwick? Now, Gatwick was a more intelligent decision, but it was a much more blameworthy decision in terms of the risk you took. And so this is why innovation is so difficult within large organizations, because the need to defend the decision overrides the need to make a good decision. And so anything that's a bit counterintuitive or anything that's a bit unexpected or illogical or eccentric is very, very high risk in terms of blame. And so large companies often end up leaving the entrepreneurs to take those kind of risks, not because they can't afford to take the risks themselves, they could, but simply because the culture within a large organization makes it career suicide to try something adventurous and fail. And defensive decision making isn't only a problem in business, it's a big problem in medicine. Because doctors will send people in for invasive investigative surgery, not because it's really a sensible idea on balance, but simply because they know you can get sued for doing nothing, whereas you can't get sued for doing something. And so it probably leads to extraordinary both medical costs and financial costs in medicine, which is decisions being taken essentially defensively. In probabilistic terms, they don't make sense, but in reputational terms, they kind of do.
Yeah. And Rory, taking all these amazing insights into consideration, would you have some actionable tips for startup founders?
Yeah. So one thing I'd recommend in any organization hoping to learn is to ring fence money and metrics, and don't apply the same metrics to every part of the organization. Because if you do, everybody will get trapped in this kind of incrementalist improvement model. Now, it's a very interesting discovery from people who studied bees, which is that bees have this incredibly sophisticated mechanism called the waggle dance, which communicates to other bees where there is nectar and where there's pollen to be collected. And dutifully, a lot of the other bees watch the waggle dance and they fly off in that direction and duly collect some of the pollen and nectar. And that's really an incremental efficiency improvement gain. It's exploiting to the full what you already know. But then they made another discovery, which is weirdly, a certain percentage of bees don't obey the waggle dance. It varies depending on where they are in the world, the surrounding foliage and the species of bee. But about 20% of bees go off at random. And when they first looked at this, they thought, that's weird. You've had 20 million years of bee evolution. Why hasn't it optimized why haven't you had bee compliance officers demanding a higher level of adherence to the waggle dance to maximize your efficient pollen collection or nectar collection? And then they modeled it as a complex system, and they realized that for two reasons, you need to make a trade-off between exploiting what you already know and discovering what you don't. And so most of those random bee journeys are a bit of a waste of time. They would have been more efficient going off collecting some known nectar. But 1 in 100 of those journeys hits real pay dirt. They discover a completely new field of flowers has come into bloom, for example. Or equally, if you become overly dependent on what you already know, when the environment changes, let's say some cows eat all the flowers in your favorite field, you don't know where else to go. And so for reasons of resilience and for reasons of essentially upside good fortune, of actually maximizing the trade-off between exploit and explore, you need to have certain people who are engaged in explore and accept the fact that they will be less efficient in the short term than the people who are doing exploit. But in the long term, the occasional successes they have will actually ensure the survival of the whole hive. And understanding that trade-off, I don't think is well done in business at all. And we tend to assume that what is the metric for the whole business should be the metric and target applied to every single component of it. And I think that's oversimplistic. I worry about this in advertising because I said the real value of digital advertising is, to be honest, what you can discover in digital through experimentation. But if you have a
Yeah.
guy who's measured on the return of his digital advertising, what he's going to do is just try and improve the targeting by 4% every 6 months. Because if he went out and started experimenting, it might be 2 years before he made 2 or 3 really big discoveries, in which time he'd no longer have his job.
Yeah.
And so those things which Nassim Taleb, if anybody's a fan of Nassim Taleb, he talks about those activities which tend to be selected against by institutions, which have a long, manageable period of cost, but with a potentially limitless payoff.
How can startups exploit that? Like, I mean, I think it's undeniable. Everyone would agree that big corporations, they need these explorers, these innovation units, advanced innovation units. But if you're a startup with 50, 100 people, should you have these explorers, or what would you advise?
You could argue that some startups are 100% an exploration unit.
Mm-hmm.
That essentially they exist on the grounds that 9 times out of 10 we will fail. And this is certainly the model of, for example, venture capital, which is your 10 huge successes pay for. It's also the model of publishing, by the way. You know, your J.K. Rowlings and your Dan Browns pay for, you know, a whole host of other publishing.
Same for gaming. It's a hit-driven business, right?
Same for gaming. Yeah. It's a hit-driven business. And you might argue that what you need to be as a corporation is a mixture of the two. You need to exploit what you know. So, you know, as a good film company, you do need to make, you know, Ghostbusters 2. Because you know that actually, if Ghostbusters 1 was a huge success, if you have Ghostbusters 2, 2/3 of the people who watch Ghostbusters 1 will go and watch Ghostbusters 2. And it'd be silly to say, no, we're going to try and create a new platform or a new franchise every time we make a film. Okay, it's not going to happen. So you have to exploit the franchises you accidentally create. But you equally have to invest enough in doing the unusual things. You know, if you think about it, there was one year where the most successful film of the year was March of the Penguins. Anyone remember that? Okay. In the same year, I think there was an extraordinary blockbuster film with Kevin Costner, which completely bombed. Wonderful story. The studio was so unconfident about the success of Avatar that they released Alvin and the Chipmunks Part 2, The Squeakquel, 3 months early because they thought that revenues from Alvin and the Chipmunks would keep the studio in business in the event that Avatar was a disaster. And the truth is that we don't know as much as we like to pretend we think we know. Because in business, we always pretend we know more than we really do. And we never like to talk in business about the areas of uncertainty, like psychology. We much rather talk about supply chains and logistics, which are kind of deterministic and simple optimization problems, than to talk about marketing, which is inherently messy. I mean, one of the things I say about marketing, for example, is unlike physics, first of all, like biology and unlike physics, it's actually a science of exceptions. It's not a science of generalizations or universal laws. And the second thing in marketing is in physics, the opposite of a good idea is wrong. Okay. In marketing, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. So actually, you know, the opposite of something in marketing may well be a huge success. Whereas in physics, there's this idea of the single right answer, and that doesn't exist in marketing because, you know, there isn't one solution to a problem. There are many. It's not in the same field. It's a science, but it's a different kind of science.
Right. Rory, there's one question I'm particularly interested in your answer. We live in an attention economy. It's increasingly difficult to get the attention, the eyeballs of customers. I read last week a piece of research that said that 500 million apps are going to get created in the next 5 years. 500 million apps. Think about that. Like, I mean, that's more apps than the last 40 years. When I was in my 20s, I read a lot of marketing books. And the belief was the best marketing is a great product. A great product is the best marketing. But is that still the case? Does the best product win? In the last years, I noticed a change in marketing sentiment. And I believe that is because of the attention economy. The belief seems to be more and more that you don't necessarily need a better product than your competitors. Instead, you need to simply stand out. Seth Godin says as much in his book, Purple Cow. Right?
Purple Cow, of course. Yeah.
So, So is being remarkable, is being different, the new USP? Should companies focus more on that than just trying to compete on a product and
Well,
feature
this
level?
brings us back to this whole theory of mind that actually it may be that human progress has gone from being a technological and distribution problem to being a demand problem and a marketing problem. And you may be right in that there are certain areas, by the way, where the very profusion of choice is a catastrophe. Because you could have argued, I mean, this is a contentious one, but I actually proposed before the pandemic that the UK government should buy Zoom for the country. And my argument was that although this would be an arbitrary decision, by settling on a single standard, we would have accelerated the adoption of video conferencing far more than every time a client of yours held a video conference, you had to download a new little bit of software and master a completely new interface, okay? And so in some cases, just the profusion of choice is an obstacle even to the best and best marketed products in the category, which is simply that, you know, if you have too much choice, the human defaults to doing nothing at all. And that's a wonderful book by Barry Schwartz called The Paradox of Choice. And in other cases, I think you're right that by making something highly distinctive, by making something, how would I describe it? And that often involves, by the way, an element of something which seems either silly or indeed silly or trivial. It's the first thing the finance director will try to kill. And the examples of this I include Kano theory. I don't know if you're familiar with this, the Japanese theory around that products have three attributes. He was a professor at the University of Tokyo. And there are basically table stakes, which are necessary attributes for a product, but they don't create any happiness. They don't create, it's simply, you know, if you buy a brand of milk and the carton leaks, you won't buy that brand more than twice. But nobody ever cares, I love this brand of milk because the carton is so reliable. It's just a given. And those are kind of just basic functional attributes. Then there are performance attributes, which are more closely aligned. And the relationship between performance and happiness tends to be quite linear. And that would be if you were making a cassette deck in the 1980s, that would be something like sound quality, battery life, you know, those kind of things which engineers do, quite rightly, focus on. But then there's this third category of element, which is called a delight attribute. And the interesting thing about it is it's often surprisingly trivial or tangential, but it creates a disproportionate amount of attention or happiness. And an example of that in the 1980s cassette deck would be the eject mechanism. So that, you know, the eject mechanism is not really central to the function. But when you pressed eject, if your cassette deck just went clack, that was shit. That was a crap cassette deck, and I don't want that. On the other hand, if it had a kind of damped hydraulic mechanism where the cassette hissed outwards and then was presented to you like a gift. And I don't know if you ever stayed in a DoubleTree hotel, but the DoubleTree hotel, they give you the cookies when you check in. And apparently the finance director of DoubleTree has been trying to kill the cookies for years. And the marketing director, to wind him up, it's always a him, isn't it? To wind him up makes the cookies bigger. But, you know, I'm a Brit, okay? And I checked in at the DoubleTree and they said, to welcome you to the DoubleTree, here's a bag of our signature cookies. American kind of crap, you know, what the hell is this crap, you know? But the two things are, they've got an oven underneath the check-in desk, which keeps the cookies warm. And secondly, the cookies are really, really delicious. And so I took them up to my room and I turned on the television. Cookies, bloody. And then I tried one. It was absolutely delicious. And actually, rather sweetly, during COVID, they released the recipe, which I thought was a lovely touch, saying, you're probably missing our cookies.
Amazing.
Now, nobody ever says, you know, I'm staying at a hotel, what are the cookies like? But the very fact that it's unnecessary makes it meaningful. So the extraordinary thing about delight attributes is it's almost the very gratuitousness of it that makes it so charming. And I think, you know, so the very, you know, anybody would worry about battery life and sound quality and all those things. But the eject mechanism is proof of kind of love. It's proof of discretionary effort. It's rather like the peacock's tail, that it contains meaning precisely because it's pointless. You know, only someone who really cared would do this.
Absolutely.
And so so this is why the finance director is often the enemy of innovation, because they're trying to get rid of the cookies.
Love it. So, Rory, on a completely different note, have you watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix?
Yes, and I have started to turn off my notifications, and this is an interesting one, by the way, because it's worth remembering that you can, I'm not naive, you can use this behavioral science for ill. Quite often, by the way, what is believed to be deliberate hacking of our mental weakness is often actually not deliberate. It was discovered by accident. I think the reason you always get the sweets, the candy by the till in supermarkets, the theory is children will pester their parents for candy because they're at eye level and they're while the child is queuing up. Or else you've already spent £80 on responsible purchases, so you'll feel much less guilty spending £2.50 on some chocolate bars, which are discretionary, because compared to the £80, it feels like a rounding error. And there are two possible reasons why you put candy next to the till. I suspect that actually people simply discovered by accident that when you put candy by the till, you sell more candy. And other shops copied that, and so it became standard. I think it was actually a product of evolutionary discovery rather than deliberate intent, in fact. But what's interesting is that, okay, that is dodgy, but it's worth remembering it only affects us when we're standing at a till. The problem when these hacks are present in our pocket, in other words, phantom vibration, the endless need to check our phone's notification, is hugely problematic because the device and therefore the hack is with you 24 hours a day. And by the way, we've looked at it very much when we've looked at Facebook and we've looked at Google and we've looked at Snapchat and Instagram and so forth. We also need to look at these accidental psychological problems that are caused by more serious technologies like email, for example. So, I think that what's fascinating is that, nobody has really done a survey on the extent to which email damages productivity as well as possibly improving it. The fact that actually it's very difficult to spend an hour and a half in pure concentration because you're always terrified that your boss might have sent you an email in the last 45 minutes and you feel that overpowering urge to check. And so actually, it's not just the intentional technologies like Facebook, which, let's face it, a lot of it wasn't intent. It was just accidental discoveries. So the algorithm will go, that's interesting. If I basically share an extreme political point of view, it gets much more attention than a moderate political point of view. Now, the algorithm doesn't know about politics. It just knows that this kind of thing is disproportionately attractive. Now, that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. If you think about it, what is the one thing that's guaranteed to get you to get out of bed and look out of the window? It's a fight on the street, isn't it? If you live in a town, okay, and you hear two people walking past your house going, it's a nice day today, isn't it? Yes, lovely. I think it might rain tomorrow. You do not get out of your chair. But the second you hear, you bastard, I'm going to kill you, you're up there with your nose pressed against the glass. And so as humans, we have these evolved instincts, which is that we pay disproportionate attention to conflict, which when you think about it in the evolutionary terms, makes massive sense. Now, an algorithm is going to discover that within days. But equally, email, there's a thing called variable reinforcement theory, which they discovered also by accident. So they were making pigeons peck things in return for a food reward. And the penguin pecked the button, it got 3 food pellets. Eventually, did I say penguin? It was pigeon. Sorry. Eventually, the pigeon got bored and it would stop pecking. Okay, I peck that button, I get 3 pellets. I've got enough pellets, I'm not interested. Then they ran low on pellets, so they started making it variable. So sometimes you got 1, sometimes you got 3, sometimes you got 5, sometimes you got 0. Okay? And then they discovered they created a pigeon fruit machine. And the bloody things would just keep pecking and pecking and pecking because they didn't know what they were going to get next. And it basically was a hack. Now, in the same way, I think email is exactly that. It's variable reinforcement. I check my email. Sometimes they're just 5 spams and I can delete them. Sometimes there's an urgent email. But I think we need to be really conscious of those areas where normal human judgment is susceptible to abuse. And actually, email is the fruit machine in the office. if you think of it like that. So the reason I'm saying this is it's not entirely to the blame of Facebook. They just set out to create attention and discovered, unfortunately, that a fight creates many more eyeballs than an agreement.
True. So we have 4 minutes left, and I have 3 questions left. So first, for everyone who got interested in behavioral marketing, would you have books, newsletters, other resources you could recommend?
Yes, we Ogilvy have a podcast called Oh Behave, which is on Spotify and other podcast platforms. There's my book Alchemy, which I obviously will recommend.
Sure.
I'd also recommend perhaps Dan Ariely's book Predictably Irrational. I'd recommend Richard Thaler's book Misbehaving, and also Nudge, which he co-wrote with Cass Sunstein. I'd also recommend Robert Cialdini, who in many ways is the godfather of this field. And his books on influence are really interesting.
I second that. Yeah, I second that. So, last 2. Rory, you are... Yeah, sorry, you forgot.
One other book, a friend of mine in London, The Choice Factory. If you're specifically in marketing, Richard Shotton's written a book called The Choice Factory, which I very highly recommend.
Awesome. I didn't know that one, so noted. Rory, you're also the author of The Wiki Man, available on Amazon at prices between roughly £2 and more than £2,300. £2 versus £2,300.
There's something.
How come?
Well, I think what it is Amazon has a pricing algorithm. And occasionally, if there's high demand for the book and very, very low supply, it will automatically just ramp up the price to an insane level. Now, what the Amazon algorithm doesn't understand is substitution, which is that, to be absolutely honest, for £3,000, I'll come round to your house and read you the book. So, there is a point at which no one's going to buy that book. And so the algorithm is, to some extent, economically logical, but like many algorithms, it's not aware of, it only knows what it knows. And that's always something to beware when we try and essentially construct models of the world. Never forget that the model only knows of which it knows, which tends to be constrained only to those things that are mathematically expressible. And of course, lots of human emotions aren't mathematically expressible, because essentially, there isn't an SI unit for impatience or uncertainty. And so I always think that mathematical models often fail really to capture the full complexity and unevenness and non-linearity of human emotional response.
Did anyone buy it for 2,000?
I don't think so.
I hope so.
I hope so.
Yeah. Cool. So, Rory, final and perhaps the most important question. Is it true that you live in the former home of Napoleon III?
Yes, I live in the roof, in the attic. And it was a very interesting discovery. I try and deploy creativity in my private life as much as I do in my work life. And I realized that what you had to do in buying property was you had to cultivate eccentric tastes. Because if your tastes in housing were the same as everybody else of your age group, you'd end up competing with everybody else for the same building. And I realized that nobody who moves to the country wants to live in an apartment. And so I live in a second floor flat in the roof of this 18th century country house by Robert Adam, who's one of the great British architects of the 18th century. The other thing I discovered, which is fun, architecture is the cheapest way of buying art. So a Picasso will be literally 1 million times more expensive than an indifferent painting by a rubbish artist, which is the same size. Strangely, the premium you pay for spectacular architecture is more or less nil. Now, some of that is because you maybe aren't allowed to interfere with it, which is a plus to me because it prevents my wife building an extension, But one of the most interesting things is there's a website called Right on the Market. There's another website in the UK called themodernhouse.net. And they're specialist websites for people who are less preoccupied with location and more preoccupied with architectural magnificence. And you can find real bargains on there, which is houses in unexpected locations where the architecture of the house is magnificent. And Dan Ariely, who's another wonderful writer, and also Shlomo Benazzi, a great behavioral scientist at UCLA, we both agree that the quality of the design of your house has a major bearing on happiness. That simply the quality of the aesthetics and the design is actually really important to your happiness. I always envy
that.
You don't live in a huff house, do you? I always envy Germans for being able to have a huff house. It always strikes me as a particularly fantastic way to live.
That's true. So, Rory, thanks so much. It was definitely worth putting on my jacket.
It's a huge pleasure. It's been an honor. Thank you. And
Right.
likewise, Ogilvy's got a relationship with Samsung, so anytime anybody wants to ring up, I'm completely happy. If anybody has questions, I'm on Twitter at Rory Sutherland, and we have this relationship. So if you can think of anything where behavioral science or the wider network's useful, please don't hesitate to get in touch.